Inferiority complex. An inferiority complex is like carrying an invisible weight that makes you feel smaller than everyone else. Imagine walking into a room and instantly feeling that everyone there is better, smarter, or more capable than you. This isn't just occasional self-doubt, it's a deep-seated belief that you're fundamentally inadequate. People with inferiority complexes often develop this pattern in childhood. Maybe they were constantly compared to siblings, criticized heavily by parents, or struggled in school. These experiences create a mental lens through which they view all future situations, automatically positioning themselves at the bottom of any social or professional hierarchy. What makes this complex particularly tricky is how it creates self-fulfilling prophecies. When you believe you're inferior, you might avoid challenges, speak softly, or hide your opinions. This behavior then leads to missed opportunities and reduced success, which seems to prove the original belief of inadequacy. It's like a snake eating its own tail. The complex often manifests in two opposite behaviors. Some people become extremely shy and withdrawn, avoiding situations where they might be exposed as inadequate. Others overcompensate dramatically, becoming aggressive overachievers or bullies. Both reactions stem from the same root of feeling fundamentally not good enough. Most profoundly, an inferiority complex isn't really about being inferior, it's about the fear of being inferior. Many highly successful people struggle with this complex, proving that external achievement doesn't automatically cure internal beliefs. This reveals how deeply psychological these patterns are, often requiring conscious work to overcome. Superiority complex. Think of a superiority complex as emotional armor made of pride. On the surface, someone with this complex appears supremely confident, even arrogant. They constantly talk about their achievements, dismiss others' opinions, and act as if they're above normal rules or considerations. But this armor hides deep wounds. Interestingly, superiority and inferiority complexes are often two sides of the same coin. The excessive pride and need to appear better than others usually develops as a defense mechanism against deep feelings of inadequacy. It's like building a fortress to protect a vulnerable core. The complex affects relationships in predictable ways. People with superiority complexes struggle to maintain close connections because they can't admit mistakes, show vulnerability, or truly empathize with others. They often end up isolated, which can reinforce their defensive behavior, creating a cycle of loneliness and increased superiority displays. In professional settings, this complex can initially appear as strong leadership, but usually reveals its problems over time. These individuals struggle with teamwork, resist feedback, and may sabotage projects if they're not in control. Their need to be above others often prevents them from learning and growing. Most revealingly, people with superiority complexes often experience intense anxiety when their self-image is threatened. A simple criticism or failure can trigger disproportionate anger or depression, showing how fragile their emotional structure really is. This reveals that true confidence isn't about feeling superior, it's about being comfortable with both strengths and weaknesses.
Click subscribe to this channel to get more topics you love.
Imposter syndrome. Imposter syndrome is like being a star actor who's convinced they're about to be exposed as a terrible performer, despite winning multiple awards. It's the persistent belief that your successes are flukes and that you've somehow fooled everyone into thinking you're competent. What makes this complex fascinating is that it often affects high achievers. The more someone accomplishes, the more convinced they become that they're just lucky or good at fooling people. This creates a painful paradox where each new success increases rather than decreases their anxiety. The syndrome has a unique way of distorting reality. When things go well, people with imposter syndrome attribute it to luck or external factors. When things go wrong, they see it as confirmation of their fraudulence. This selective interpretation creates a mental framework where no amount of evidence can prove their competence to themselves. In professional settings, imposter syndrome can lead to either overwork or self-sabotage. Some people work exhaustively to prevent being found out, while others might avoid promotions or new opportunities because they don't feel worthy. Both responses prevent healthy professional development and work-life balance. At its core, imposter syndrome reveals something profound about human psychology. Our self-image can be remarkably resistant to objective evidence. This suggests that confidence and self-worth must be built from within, not just through external achievements. Mother complex. A mother complex is like having an invisible umbilical cord that continues to influence your life long after childhood. This psychological pattern shapes how you relate to others, make decisions, and view yourself, all through the lens of your relationship with your mother or maternal figure. This complex can manifest in various ways. Some people become eternally dependent, seeking mother figures in all their relationships. Others might swing to the opposite extreme, fiercely rejecting anything that reminds them of maternal care. Both reactions show how powerful the original maternal relationship remains in their psyche. In romantic relationships, a mother complex often creates complicated dynamics. Someone might seek partners who will mother them, or they might try to mother their partners. Others might avoid commitment entirely, fearing the kind of emotional entanglement they experienced with their mother. These patterns can repeat across relationships until they're consciously recognized. The workplace isn't immune to these dynamics either. People with mother complexes might struggle with female authority figures, either becoming overly compliant or rebellious. They might also recreate maternal dynamics with colleagues, taking on nurturing roles or seeking protection from others. Most importantly, a mother complex isn't inherently negative, it's about awareness. Understanding how your maternal relationship affects your adult life is the first step toward choosing which patterns to keep and which to change. Father complex. A father complex functions like an invisible script that plays out in all authority relationships. Whether the father was absent, overbearing, or inconsistent, the pattern of relating to paternal authority becomes a template for how a person interacts with power throughout their life. This complex often manifests in two main ways: either a deep-seated rebellion against authority or an excessive need for approval from authority figures. Someone might consistently challenge their bosses, or they might become the eternal good employee desperately seeking validation. Both responses trace back to the original father relationship. In personal relationships, a father complex can create complicated dynamics around power and control. People might be drawn to partners who remind them of their father, either to recreate and fix the relationship or to play out old patterns of conflict. Others might avoid partners who display any traits similar to their father, limiting their relationship choices. The professional impact can be significant. Career choices might be influenced by trying to please or rebel against paternal expectations. Leadership styles often reflect either an attempt to be the father they never had or a reaction against the father they did have. Perhaps most profoundly, a father complex shapes one's relationship with their own personal authority. The ability to trust one's judgment, make decisions, and feel confident in one's power often ties back to these early paternal experiences. Hero complex. A hero complex is like wearing an invisible cape that compels you to rush into every crisis, whether you're needed or not. This complex goes beyond simple altruism. It's a psychological need to be the rescuer, often at the expense of your own well-being or the actual needs of others. What drives this complex is fascinating. It often stems from early experiences where someone had to be strong for others, usually in childhood. This created a pattern where self-worth became tied to helping others, making it difficult to feel valuable unless actively solving problems. The complex manifests in various ways. Some people constantly seek dangerous or dramatic situations where they can play the hero. Others might create crises by enabling dependent behavior in others, ensuring they'll always be needed. Both patterns reflect a deep need to be seen as the indispensable savior. In relationships, people with hero complexes often choose partners who need saving. This can create unhealthy dynamics where one person remains in crisis to maintain the other's hero role. Professional life can also be affected, with these individuals taking on too many responsibilities or inserting themselves into situations where their help isn't required. Most revealingly, hero complex sufferers often struggle with receiving help themselves. Their identity is so tied to being the helper that being helped feels threatening to their self-image. This reveals how the complex isn't really about helping others, it's about maintaining a specific role and self-image. Persecution complex. A persecution complex is like wearing special glasses that make everyone look like a potential enemy. People with this complex live in a world where they believe they're constantly under attack, even when there's no real threat. It's more than just paranoia, it's a complete worldview where persecution feels inevitable. This complex often develops from early experiences of genuine unfairness or betrayal. However, it then takes on a life of its own, creating a filter through which all interactions are interpreted as potentially hostile. Even neutral or positive interactions become suspect, as the person searches for hidden meanings or future threats. In professional settings, this complex can be particularly destructive. Simple workplace dynamics become elaborate conspiracies. A colleague's success feels like a personal attack. Constructive feedback is interpreted as evidence of prejudice. This mindset can lead to isolation, as the person gradually pushes away potential allies and supporters. Relationships suffer uniquely under this complex. Trust becomes almost impossible, as the person constantly looks for signs of betrayal. They might test their loved ones with elaborate scenarios or interpret innocent actions as proof of malicious intent. This creates a self-fulfilling prophecy where their suspicious behavior actually drives others away. Most profoundly, a persecution complex reveals how our beliefs shape our reality. By expecting persecution, people with this complex often behave in ways that create tension and conflict, seemingly confirming their fears. Understanding this cycle is crucial for breaking free from it. God complex. A God complex is like being trapped in a hall of mirrors that only reflect greatness back at you. Unlike simple arrogance, this complex involves a deep-seated belief in one's absolute superiority and infallibility. It's a psychological fortress built on the foundation of perceived omnipotence. What makes this complex particularly fascinating is its relationship with vulnerability. Often the grandiose beliefs serve as protection against deep feelings of powerlessness or insignificance. The higher the walls of perceived divinity, the more fragile the foundation they're trying to protect. In professional environments, people with God complexes often rise to positions of power through sheer force of will and confidence. However, their leadership style typically becomes toxic. They resist input from others, ignore warning signs, and may make catastrophic decisions because they believe they can't be wrong. Relationships with someone who has a God complex are particularly challenging. They expect constant admiration and compliance, struggling with any sign of independence or criticism from others. Their partners and friends often feel diminished, as there's no room for equal partnership when one person believes they're divine. The most revealing aspect of a God complex is how it handles failure. When reality contradicts their self-image, these individuals often experience severe psychological crises. This suggests that beneath the grandiose exterior lies a fragile sense of self that cannot integrate normal human limitations. Martyr complex. A martyr complex is like carrying a cross that nobody asked you to bear, then expecting recognition for your voluntary suffering. This complex involves a pattern of self-sacrifice that serves psychological needs rather than genuine necessity. The person becomes invested in their own suffering as a source of identity and power. The complex often develops as a strategy for gaining love or attention. Someone learns early that suffering can be currency in relationships. The more they sacrifice, the more they feel entitled to recognition and appreciation. This creates a paradoxical situation where they seek out opportunities to suffer. In relationships, the martyr complex creates a toxic dynamic. The person with the complex may deliberately take on unnecessary burdens, then resent others for making them do so. They might refuse help to maintain their suffering, while simultaneously complaining about lack of support. This creates a no-win situation for those around them. Professional life can become a stage for martyrdom as well. These individuals often take on too much work, refuse assistance, then use their overwork as evidence of their indispensability or others' inadequacy. They might sabotage efficiency improvements to maintain their narrative of necessary suffering. Most importantly, the martyr complex reveals how suffering can become a form of control. By maintaining the role of the sacrificial victim, these individuals often wield significant emotional power over others through guilt and obligation. Abandonment complex. An abandonment complex is like having an internal alarm system that's constantly scanning for signs of desertion. Even in secure relationships, people with this complex live with a persistent fear that everyone they care about will eventually leave them. This creates a hypervigilance that can paradoxically push people away. The roots of this complex typically trace back to early experiences of loss or inconsistent care. What makes it particularly powerful is how it becomes self-reinforcing. The fear of abandonment leads to clingy or controlling behavior, which can strain relationships, potentially leading to actual abandonment, confirming the original fear. In romantic relationships, this complex manifests in various destructive patterns. Some people become emotional chameleons, constantly changing themselves to please their partners. Others might sabotage relationships, preemptively leaving before they can be left. Still others might choose unreliable partners, unconsciously recreating their abandonment narrative. Professional relationships aren't immune to this complex either. People might resist career advancement for fear of leaving a secure position, or they might overwork to make themselves indispensable. But team dynamics can be affected when someone with this complex interprets normal workplace changes as personal rejection. Perhaps most profoundly, an abandonment complex reveals how early attachment patterns can shape our entire approach to human connection. It's not just about fear of being left, it's about a fundamental belief in the impermanence of love and security. Perfectionism complex. A perfectionism complex is like having an internal critic with impossible standards and a megaphone. Unlike healthy striving for excellence, This complex creates a paralyzing fear of imperfection that can make even simple tasks feel overwhelming. It's not about doing things well, it's about the terror of doing anything less than perfectly. But what makes this complex particularly insidious is how it masquerades as virtue. Society often praises perfectionism as dedication to excellence, but the reality is far darker. Perfectionists often achieve less than they could because they're either paralyzed by fear of failure or spend excessive time on unnecessary details. The impact on creative work can be devastating. People with this complex often have numerous unfinished projects or ideas they never started because they couldn't guarantee perfect execution. They might revise endlessly, never feeling ready to share their work with the world. This leads to a tragic waste of potential. In professional settings, perfectionism can look like success on the surface while causing significant internal distress. These individuals might produce high-quality work, but at the cost of burnout, anxiety, and inability to delegate. They often struggle with time management because every task must be done perfectly. Most revealingly, perfectionism is often rooted in conditional self-worth, the belief that you're only valuable if you're perfect. This suggests that the real work isn't in trying harder to be perfect, but in developing self-acceptance regardless of performance. Guilt complex. A guilt complex is like wearing emotional handcuffs that make you feel responsible for everything that goes wrong, whether it's your fault or not. This goes beyond normal feelings of responsibility. It's an excessive, often irrational burden of guilt that colors every experience and relationship. The complex often develops in childhood, usually in environments where children were made to feel responsible for adult problems or emotions. This creates a pattern where the person becomes hyper-aware of their impact on others, taking on responsibility for things far beyond their control. In relationships, people with guilt complexes often become emotional sponges, absorbing others' unhappiness and feeling responsible for fixing it. They might stay in unhealthy relationships out of guilt, or exhaust themselves trying to prevent others from experiencing any discomfort. This creates unbalanced relationships where they're constantly giving but struggle to receive. Professional life can become particularly challenging. These individuals might take blame for team failures, apologize excessively, or avoid promotions because they feel unworthy. They might also overwork to compensate for perceived inadequacies, leading to burnout and decreased effectiveness. At its core, a guilt complex reveals a distorted sense of human agency and responsibility. It suggests a magical thinking where one person believes they have far more control over outcomes than is realistically possible.